Good morning. Today what I'd like to do is provide a brief overview of the distinctions between general operating support and specific project support in connection with the grant making of private foundations. As we know, private foundations face certain technical restrictions on how they can deploy funds for charitable purposes. We have three basic options when we think about it. The first is a direct charitable expenditure, where a private foundation actually deploys funds for charitable purposes or retains agents or consultants to carry out programs and activities on its behalf. The second two relate to specific grants to individuals and grants to organizations. The individual grant making, as we know, is restricted under Section 4945 and requires that if a foundation wants to make a grant to an individual, it must do so pursuant to approved IRS procedures if the grant is for travel, study, or other similar purposes. If a foundation wants to make other kinds of grants, for example, hardship grants, pure charity to indigent people that don't involve travel, study, or other similar purposes, then it doesn't need those approved provisions. When it makes a grant to an organization, on the other hand, the regulations and the tax code require that those grants be made to public charities or their foreign equivalents or to governmental entities. With respect to all other grants to any other kind of entity, the private foundation needs to exercise expenditure responsibility, which is a way to approximate the comfort that a private foundation has when it makes a grant to a charitable entity that the money will be used for charitable purposes. Expenditure responsibility has a lot of requirements. We won't necessarily go into them right now, but one of the main things that's relevant for our conversation today is that expenditure responsibility requires that the grant be made pursuant to a written agreement or a written commitment of the grantee to, among other things, use the funds for a specific charitable purpose, and that if that money is not used for the charitable purpose, that the money needs to be returned. So that essentially sets up how we are thinking about general operating support and project grant support. If we think about the fact that a private foundation has to deploy its assets for the charitable purposes and can only make grants for general purposes to a public charity, and if it makes grants to someone else, it needs to specify the project or the purpose, then we set up sort of our universe with respect to general operating support and private and project support. So when we think about general operating support, we think about support that is essentially to support all aspects of the organization's activities. It's not making any delineations between programs or projects. And there's no specific direction about how that money can be used. It simply say, here's money, use it for your general operating support, and it essentially supports everything. So the money diffuses into the entire organization, and it supports all the organization does. A project grant, on the other hand, focuses on a specific project or activity, and either has direction from the foundation in response to a grant proposal or conversations with the grantee, but the goal is that we're only supporting one specific thing the organization does. Now, if we're talking about general operating support, because of the charitable restrictions we talked about earlier, only other charitable organizations are eligible to receive general operating support. When we talk about specific project support, we can make those to charitable organizations or non-charitable organizations, but we cannot make general operating support grants to non-charitable organizations. So why does it matter? Well, because the first is the restrictions we talked about a minute ago. If we're making a grant to a non-charitable entity, then we have to make a project support grant. So that's a compliance issue, because we can't fund things that are general in operation in nature. If we're making a grant to a charitable entity and we want to make a project support grant, the reason we do that is because we want to focus the organization on a specific project or task, and we want to exercise, control is the wrong word, but direction and supervision over how the funds are used. It also gives the foundation the ability to say, if you don't use it for these purposes, I can get my money back, and so it holds the charity's feet to the fire. The other and the last thing we'll talk about is advocacy and lobbying. That if you can make a general operating support grant to a public charity that lobbies, and you're not directing it to specific projects, they can use it as it wants as long as it's consistent with their charitable purposes. If you're focusing on a project, you can then direct money to an advocacy project, and so long as we follow what's called the project grant rule, which essentially says that to the extent there is lobbying in a project, so long as the non-lobbying portion exceeds the amount of the foundation's grant, then we don't have to worry about the fact that the charity might be lobbying in connection with the project we're supporting, nor do we care if other foundations are funding it. We only focus on our activities. So that's essentially why we care about it. Just two last points. One, it's incongruous in the general operating support context to specify how the money needs to be used. As we talked about, general operating support is for general operating activities. And lastly, when we think about reporting, it's also incongruous to require reports on specific projects in the general operating support context if you're giving it for essentially everything the organization does. And that's, you know, a thing we see often where a foundation will give a general operating support grant and they'll say, give us a report on how you specifically spent the funds. Sometimes people do it, sometimes people don't, but it's odd. And so that's it, sort of general operating support in a nutshell. Thanks for being here today, and have a good day.